We begin with a special in-depth focus report looking at new training for the police patrolling your streets. Across the Commonwealth, officers are now getting enhanced instruction specifically to prepare them for incidents involving someone with a mental illness. WGBH News reporter Adam Riley attended one of the sessions and takes us inside.
It looks like a hazing ritual or some sort of weird party game. Two men sit across from each other. One asks questions and one tries to answer, while two others bombard him with a torrent of abuse.
Listen up. Get up and leave. Where were you born?
These MBTA police cadets are getting a crash course in schizophrenia, what it's like to have it and what it's like to deal with someone who does.
As the booking officer, what did you notice of the person you were trying to book?
I saw different facial expressions. Eyes looking left to right, trying to find out where they're going. Smiling, frowning, laughing, all at once.
According to psychiatrist Deborah Pinels, those are cues that police can misconstrue.
You may see people who are making gestures. They may have funny body movements that you're observing. Again, not to be threatening or frightening, although they can be misinterpreted easily.
Massachusetts police recruits used to receive just 4 hours of training on mental illness. But recently, that was raised to 12 hours. Taunton police officer Steve Turner says that modest increase could have a major impact.
In the past, we've arrested people that really don't belong in the criminal justice field or in the court system. Now we have other options. We have a list of and a host of people to call and agencies to call and crisis units to come down and help the people with the stress that they're going through. And instead of putting them in the court and possibly putting them in jail, it's much better for them and it's much better for the jails too.
That's because the prison system is overwhelmed by mentally ill inmates. What's more, interactions between police and mentally ill persons turn deadly all too often. In Quincy last year, Wilfredo Justiniano was fatally shot during a confrontation. Investigators found that the shooting was justified, but Justiniano's family says he was mentally ill and died needlessly.
What are these cops doing? Don't they go to training? They should have other protocols.
Now, when you think of a police officer's job responsibilities, helping people with mental illnesses doesn't necessarily top the list. And that can make some trainees a bit reluctant.
Some people who think this isn't really their role and it isn't really their job, and if everything was better in the world, then they wouldn't have to deal with this.
But Pinels adds not every officer is a skeptic.
Other veteran officers, this sense of, this is really important because now I've been out in the field for 20 years and I know that I'm going to have almost 1 in 10 calls that's going to involve an emotionally disturbed person, and boy, I wish I had had this training earlier on.
And Turner says the ones who do get it will be glad they did.
What we're hoping for is some empathetic skills. Take a little extra time and come on the streets with a little more knowledge of persons with mental illness. And it betters the police officer for their own safety because they have knowledge of people with mental illness. And it also, safety of others as well as the person with mental illness.
Well, we were there. You could really see the recruits moving from skepticism to engagement over the course of a couple hours. And Emily, obviously, the hope is that as more officers get this training, they'll just come to take it for granted that this is a fundamental part of the job they do.
These kinds of in-house trainings often tend to elicit eye-rolling and that kind of thing. Did the officers seem really engaged?
They really did. This curriculum was designed by the Department of Mental Health here in Massachusetts and by the National Alliance on Mental Illness. And I think that if it had only been taught by representatives of those groups, maybe police wouldn't have taken the points as seriously. But as we saw, it was co-taught by Deborah Pinels, who's here today, and also Stephen Turner, who's a Taunton police officer. The officers who were getting the training were actually MBTA police officers who we showed close up, but also officers from towns across the Commonwealth. And I think that for them, having an actual active police officer tell them that this stuff was important, that they should know it, I think that made them listen more than they might otherwise have.
All right, Adam, thanks for that.
Thanks, Emily.
Well, according to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, up to 30% of the calls police respond to each day involve someone with a mental illness. My next guest is an expert on the intersection of psychiatric disorders and criminal justice. We met Dr. Deborah Pinels in Adams Peace. She's with the Department of Mental Health and teaches psychiatry at UMass Medical School. Welcome to Greater Boston, Deborah.
Well, thank you. This
is quite an operation. How often have you been going into doing these kinds of training sessions?
Well, these particular training sessions is a new curriculum that was recently developed through the Department of Mental Health in collaboration with NAMI and the Municipal Police Training Committee. The Department of Mental
NAMI being?
The National Alliance on Mental
Okay.
Illness. Thank you. The Department of Mental Health has been involved in doing police trainings for many, many years. What this curriculum offers is an extended period of training, an extended length of training for new recruit officers, which is really important because these officers will be hitting the street, taking on the roles and responsibilities, and this topic area of mental health they will see becomes relevant to their jobs.
The Boston Globe just recently reported that there was an uptick in shootings of police, usually involving incidents with people who have some kind of emotional or mental disorder. Will this kind of training help out?
What this training is attempting to do is to help give officers another tool in their toolkit of how they can respond to situations. So instead of only teaching about command presence and the things that officers traditionally have been trained about, it teaches them about how to recognize signs and symptoms of mental illness, not diagnose them, but also how to use de-escalation strategies, how to work with people who may be in some kind of an emotional crisis, and use patience and conversation and observation to help identify people who might be in distress, who need services rather than arrest.
All right, I'm going to bring someone else into this discussion. This is Leslie Walker. She's the executive director of the Prisoners Legal Services, a Boston-based nonprofit. She's successfully represented a group of mentally ill inmates challenging the use of solitary confinement in Massachusetts prisons. Welcome to you, Leslie.
Thank you.
What would you say, in Massachusetts anyway, is the percentage of people incarcerated that actually have some form of mental illness?
The Department of Correction reports about 23% of its population, 11,300 people, are open mental health cases who have some sort of a mental health need. The sheriffs report even higher numbers. They're not quite as consistent, but many sheriffs report as high as 50%. The Department of Correction also reports 15% of its population, so 15% of the 11,300 have a serious mental illness. So these are people who, many of whom would have been committed to hospitals decades ago, who are now living in our prison system.
So it's one thing for the police departments to have this kind of training. What about inside the prisons themselves? Do the corrections officers all have that kind of training as well?
They have some training. I've spoken to some officers. Some find it helpful. Some find it not particularly helpful. And many of the officers who are willing to talk while we're waiting for visits and in the visiting room wish they had more. It's just there's never enough time. There's so many people with such serious illnesses that people want to be able to respond better to someone who is perhaps hearing voices, but they don't know how. So the more training, the better. I applaud this measure, and I'm sure our clients in prison, if they'd had officers trained this way, some of them would never have ended up in the criminal justice system.
Deborah, Adam Riley touched on this case, Wilfredo Justiniano from New Bedford. And his sister and the family is very upset about this. He came on to a police officer who was carrying a pen. He didn't have a weapon, but he got increasingly more aggressive. Was that the proper response? He was shot and killed. Was there another way out of that?
Well, in terms of saying whether it was the proper response or not, that's really up to the official investigations to determine. What we do know is that through training, we can teach officers an additional set of skills, and some of the data shows that there can be improved public safety for all when officers receive sufficient training on issues related to mental illness. And again, learning communication strategies, learning even just to identify mental illness when they see it, and then learning how to de-escalate a situation. That can help achieve positive outcomes.
Well, Leslie, some of the family members are saying, like the Justinianos, that tasers are just as effective. Why go for the ultimate weapon when other things are available?
I cannot pretend to be an expert on tasers and their effects on people. I know people who are having emergencies can have a different reaction than someone who might not. People who are on medication will have a different reaction. But I certainly don't think it's a wholesale solution to the problem. But I do think the de-escalation techniques are much more important. Or, having a wound in a leg that would take someone down if they were threatening seems to be a logical extension of what the family, I'm sure, wished happened. But I don't know that the jump to tasers would be ideal, but certainly, as Deb says, the toolbox, having a lot of things in the toolbox would be helpful, including keeping someone calm until someone with mental health expertise can arrive to talk someone down. You know,
it's interesting, a lot of the people in this training were from the MBTA, and let's face it, that's a congregating place for a lot of people with mental illness, so,
very much so.
That's a good thing that those guys were in that training.
Oh, absolutely. In this training, again, for new recruits, because they'll be on the streets working with people and working in situations that they may not have been accustomed to, the idea is that they will be open to these new ideas, and the class was incredibly receptive.
They seemed to be really into it. All right, Dr. Deborah Pinels and Leslie Walker, thanks so much.